Hello, I'm Romeo Kabir. Ukraine has now been independent and nominally democratic for a quarter century. However, the country has often struggled to build accountable, transparent democratic institutions, and its elections, even at the highest level, have been marred by fraud. One former Ukrainian president, Viktor Yushchenko, was even poisoned during the 2004 presidential election. Now, after two revolutions, the Orange Revolution and the Revolution of Dignity, how has Ukraine faced the problems in its democracy, and what else can it do to improve? Joining me in the studio today is Bohdan Nahaylo, a scholar of Ukraine's political transformation from Soviet Republic to independent state, and an international advisor to Democracy Reporting International, a Berlin-based international NGO promoting democratization. Hi, Bohdan. Welcome to the program.
Hello, Romeo. Good to be here.
Thank you for being here. Now, let's get right into it. After the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, Ukraine threw out the heavily corrupt Viktor Yanukovych and elected Petro Poroshenko in his place. However, many Ukrainians still feel that their government is corrupt and unaccountable to its citizens. Now, is this a legitimate grievance? And what steps has the current administration taken to improve Ukrainians' trust in their government and in their democracy?
Well, Romeo, we've seen quite a bit of progress away from the old way of doing things and the old regime associated with Yanukovych. But on the other hand, the results have only been mixed. And for many, they're frustrating, disappointing, and so much more remains to be done. On the positive side, there's been a change in the mentality of many, hence civil society is much stronger. The younger generation certainly, by and large, thinks differently and is better equipped through the social media, through knowledge of English language, travel, to deal and address these problems. However, on the other hand, the authorities right at the top seem to be very reluctant to actually dismantle the old system, to transform it radically, and to bring in a modern European type of state. There's been a lot of lip service paid to that, under pressure, obviously, from the EU, from the IMF, from civil society. But the results in terms of the actual changes have left us wanting more. Let's take, for example, legal reform. One of the benchmarks, or one of the high points in the last year or so, has been an attempt to transform the obsolete legal system and to really introduce rule of law into this country.
From the all-powerful Soviet prosecutor that you had under the Soviet.
It's not just the prosecution; it's the independence of the judiciary, right? This is what we're really talking about. A fair system where judges are elected on the basis of open competition, on the basis of their merits, and also they're vetted to see whether they have the ethical and professional background that is needed, and are not simply the sons of the wealthy or the daughters of the wealthy. Anyway, even that process seems to have stalled. Most recently, we had a passing of adoption of a law on the Constitutional Court, which went further than before, but it had some of the guts torn out of it by leaving this independent selection on the basis of professional and ethical criteria out. Hence, leading critics to say, look, the president will still control the Constitutional Court. But I think what's very important to note that on the positive side, we've had the crystallization of a political nation, and we have a fairly vibrant civil society, which is arming itself with the know-how and techniques that are needed to operate a modern democracy. But on the other hand, we have, I would call it, we talk of a shadow economy. We have a shadow state. We have a shadow set of semi-institutions associated with oligarchs who are really calling the shots still. And this is the disappointment, that on the one hand, there is the state that Ukrainians are supposedly building after the Revolution of Dignity, and on the other hand, this conservative, entrenched interests that are still trying to hold on to their way of doing things, the old way of doing things.
Now, I mean, it's been about 25 years or so since Ukraine became a democratic state. And you spoke of this kind of shadow state. does the shadow state directly undermine the democratic institutions? I mean, people went out on the Maidan during the Revolution of Dignity and specifically forced out the previous administration over exactly those concerns. I mean, how much of a chance is that of reoccurring if Ukrainians don't see that the democratic situation in their country is improving, that they don't see Ukraine in itself becoming more democratic?
On the surface, there is the semblance of pretty profound changes in mentality, in approaches, certainly in expectations. But the reality has remained, as I've said before, that maybe it's not the shadow state, but the shadow networks, the shadow ways of doing things that circumvent and are parallel to the state and neutralize the state's influence. I'm talking in particular about the oligarchs and the deals that they have made. One thing that is sorely lacking still, even though several years have gone by since Maidan and since the Revolution of Dignity, is the total lack of transparency. We don't know what deals have been made at the highest levels between the key, the richest people in this country, those that actually are responsible for this sort of management of the country's resources. We can only suspect. One of the great failings, I would say, of the present setup and the presidential administration and the government is this lack of transparency and also the failure to communicate with the population. There is very little effort going into explaining what is behind decisions, why such decisions are made, why this will meet tightening, that the longer terms will make it worthwhile. There is very little explanation about personnel changes. Why is somebody's friend or somebody's cousin appointed, yet others, younger people with the professional qualifications, are left outside? Why is it that we have the infighting between bodies that are dealing with corruption? Who is pulling the strings behind the scenes? You know, if it was a fair and open, transparent process, we would understand that. And I think a great failing of those in power in the last 2 or 3 years is this failure to communicate directly to the people, hence signal their accountability to their electors, to the population that has elected them to serve in their interest. And secondly, the lack of responsibility that brings, that they are above it all, that they can do things that they don't need to tell people. It's ironic that some of Ukraine's leaders are so eloquent when they go abroad, even speaking English, etc., and certainly are very good ambassadors for Ukraine in these difficult times with the war going on and under pressure. And yet at home, there is still so much doubt, there's still so much confusion, disbelief, dismay, because the population doesn't really know what's going on, which in turn fuels not only speculation, but populism. Any leader can get up and, you know, hit the drum and say, look, you know, this is against popular interest, prices hikes or whatever. And so this lack of transparency, this lack of communication, and ultimately a lack of a transparent, coherent system of policy making. Making policy that is strategic, that is long-term for the state, involving the population, involving the various parties. And instead of having the quibbling in Parliament between parties that exist on paper, because perhaps they don't really represent the initial interests that were there when they proclaimed themselves parties after the Revolution of Dignity, instead of having a coalition of national unity working towards Ukraine's future, we still have a kind of makeshift papering over differences, wheeling and dealing almost before any major constitutional law is discussed, never mind passed, because there's only been the constitutional law. So this is all very disappointing. And fortunately for Ukraine, as I've said, pressure is coming up is still there from society, especially from civil society, students, the youth, but also from international institutions, external actors, creditors of Ukraine, IMF, particularly the EU now because of the association agreement or whatnot. So they are putting that pressure on. But you don't sense, even now in 2017, as we get nearer to elections, that there is the political will to actually transform the system in a way that the population endorsed and expected those who are represented that they would do.
Now, speaking of the elections, I mean, Ukrainian presidents are elected for 5-year terms, and Poroshenko himself is up for re-election in 2019. Now, since the revolution in Dayton, has the political climate changed at all? I mean, you keep talking about these different changes, but has there been any movement away from this kind of oligarch-sponsored, get into politics to get rich kind of atmosphere that, I mean, has pervaded Ukraine since independence?
The political climate has certainly changed, somewhat for the better, but also somewhat for the worse. Somewhat for the better in the sense that you can't openly get away with the kind of plundering of state resources as happened before. And certainly there have been mechanisms brought in under pressure from the West, like e-declarations for officials, like the NABU, the anti-corruption body being created, which are monitoring and acting upon cases of alleged corruption. But the drawback is that even when action is taken, officials suspected of embezzlement, corruption are arrested. Very often they get off through a court system which is still imperfect and is still corrupt, because the legal reform that I spoke about has not fully taken effect and it still has a long way to go. And so you are left with the feeling that there is the semblance of action or lip service, but the substance is still missing. And this is what is worrying. And also what has changed in the climate, I think, is that people are concerned that the war is continuing for so long and would really need to see that the government and the presidential administration is running the country in times of war. Transparency, prioritization, explaining things more clearly, not leaving themselves open to claims that business is being done because of the war, etc. Address these charges and placate or reassure the population.
Now, what leads to this kind of aversion to open communication? I mean, what are these elites still too stuck in kind of a Soviet mentality where everything is done top down? It's a totalitarian state. The president or the general secretary gives the orders, and it's the government's jobs to simply fulfill them, and the populace lives their lives. I mean, what drives this?
I think the answer is can be approached on several levels. On the one hand, it's certainly residual, a residual matter from Soviet times, meaning there wasn't a developed democratic political culture here. And it didn't pick up with the speed that it has done in the Baltic states, say, which had their independent traditions from the interwar period. And what we have in this part of the world, in the former Soviet region and in Ukraine par excellence, is there is a very strong emotive connection to a symbol called Ukraine. And people are prepared to die for that symbol. Tradition, history, sense of belonging, family, everything that makes Ukraine for them. Language in some cases, though that is less.
In its entirety.
But the state as such hasn't, the idea of a state in the modern sense, meaning responsibilities of citizens and obligations of the state and accountability and serving the good of the people and the good of the cause, the national cause, the strategic cause, that hasn't taken hold. So the state is still seen by many, including those who make it to the top, as something that should be exploited for gain during the brief periods that they have access to the resources. And it's also a system that the state is not our friend. There's not a state, there's not a, shall we say, an idea of collective ownership, of co-ownership. This is my state. This is my Ukraine. I pay taxes because I want my state to have not just weapons, but roads and hospitals and children's and school, etc. But we still have this old Soviet approach of circumventing the system, filling my pockets and my cousins and my families, trying to avoid the obligations that a citizen is supposed to, show. And so on the one hand, then, you have this frustration with top officials who are accused of corruption, and yet at the local level, people don't say, well, it begins with me. Have I changed in my mentality? Am I a model citizen? Am I living as a citizen? Or am I simply also exploiting the state to the extent that I can, in a more subtle way? So that remains a problem. And I think that in terms of the climate, what we need to see is better education of the population, civics about their rights, about how they can organize, how they can mobilize for political action within a responsible framework, not simply going out on the streets when in frustration. What is expected of the rulers, and what the rulers are accountable, how the rulers are accountable, the temporary rulers are accountable to the population. So we need that education to raise the political culture. We need transparency, we need monitoring, but for all that to work, we also need a fair and equitable system. We need the rule of law, we need an independent judiciary, we need political parties that are political parties and not simply instruments of oligarchs, ad hoc creations to get seats in parliament and then serve these business or nefarious political interests. So we have a long way to go, but I think that quite a few important steps have been made, and certainly for many, their mentality has changed and is changing.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Bohdan. This was Bohdan Nahaylo, an international advisor at Democracy Reporting International. Thank you and good night.